Hi, what you're about to see is an interview with a vendor in the space in and around data mesh. We'd like to thank Nick Heudecker for graciously doing these interviews with vendors. We would also like to make it clear that the data mesh community and data mesh learning doesn't necessarily endorse anything that these vendors are talking about, but that we wanted to give them a voice to talk about what they may offer in the space, so people are aware of vendors, because obviously if everybody has to build everything themselves, the data mesh is going to be pretty hard. So with that, we really thank Nick for doing this great work, and we hope that this is good and useful to you.
All right, hey everybody, my name is Nick Heudecker here with another episode of Data Mesh Learning. I'm joined today by Mona Rakibe from Telmai. Telmai is an interesting company in the data observability space, certainly a hot area. And so Mona and I are going to talk about what's going on in data observability, what Telmai does. Mona, over to you. How about a quick intro?
Thank you so much, Nick. Excited to be with you on this podcast today. So let me start with a little bit of my background. I'm Mona Rakibe, as Nick mentioned, co-founder, CEO of Telmai, another data observability company. Don't confuse it with observability data company, which Nick is very familiar with.
That's us, by the way, right here. You can learn more about us up here.
Yeah. I think TechCrunch, I hope you're listening, because I saw in a recent article, they put everybody together in the same space. But really started Telmai in end of 2020, December, with my co-founder, Max Lukichev. Our goal really for Telmai was to improve the reliability of data that we are using heavily in analytics, ML, and so on. Prior to Telmai, I spent a lot of my career in master data management company, Reltio, I was the founding product manager there, heading their product management towards the end. I met Max there. Max was brought into Reltio for shifting their thinking into big data, machine learning from an engineering architecture perspective. Max actually left Reltio and joined SignalFx. That's another observability company, infrastructure observability company.
Acquired by Splunk.
Exactly, that's the one. Yeah. So that's when, like, Max is a PhD in databases. He's always been a data person. So that's where he really thought that, there's been so much innovation in everything related to data, whether it's like how we store, how we process the data, how we transfer the data. But data quality has been such an underserved and yet extremely critical area of your data ecosystem. And there's so little innovation. Even today, most companies, when we talk about data reliability, immediately start talking about rules and policies and all. So that's when he was like, let's bring the concept of observability, or what infrastructure observability companies have done very well, into the landscape of data and systematically predict and find what could be going wrong in your data, or can we really make sure that our data teams are able to understand the health of the data before the business teams start yelling at them that the data is untrustworthy, or I see the dashboards are wrong, or I feel my models are not doing properly. So that was really the problem statement we went after. And the solution approach for us is heavily using statistical analysis, metric calculation, and ML to figure out data issues.
Where does that work happen, right? If you want to equate this to infrastructure monitoring, you typically deploy agents all over your infrastructure, and sometimes they'll do processing of the data. But for the most part, they ship data from log files and whatnot into some centralized platform. That's the space we're in, so we spend a lot of time thinking about that. But how does the Telmai story realize that data reliability value? Right? Is it agents? Is it something else?
It's slightly different, but we are a metric monitoring system. And if you think about data pipeline, right? Data by nature, different from the infrastructure philosophies, data by nature is transformational. So by that, what I mean is that between source system, and it's a graph, right? Between source system to the actual consumption, there's a lot that can go in the data. There are transformations that can happen, policies can be applied. There might be microservices which are changing, validating, and improving the data. So which means that having a service or metric calculation at every step of the pipeline, or at the very least to the leftmost of the pipeline, becomes crucial. Now, how Telmai works is that take it any type of source, whether it's your data lake, data warehouse, Kafka queues, or even source CRM system, ingesting systems, and so on. We can plug into their system, we can read data, and we have change data captured. So we don't have to read all the data, but we read those data. We calculate a lot of different metrics. I'm sure you're very familiar with that. So we calculate a lot of different signals and metrics, which we call data metrics. All of these calculations happens in our Spark clusters, like our infrastructure. So we just read once, and then we start calculating this metrics. And based on these metrics, we establish a definition of what good looks like in this data, and what could be a signal that indicates that there's an issue in this data. And these indicators could be like completeness, correctness, accuracy of the data, validity, and all of that. But really, we read from these sources, process it in our Spark clusters, and then present it in terms of like monitoring output alerts, or even like REST-based response, which can be used for your pipeline orchestration.
So you mentioned completeness, correctness, accuracy. How do you judge those things? Because, I might look at a piece of data as a data integrator and I'm like, looks good to me. But then the business consumer at the other end of that is going to be like, this is way off. Correct. So there's a mix of like, is it technically correct or is it correct for the business?
I'm so glad you brought it up, because that makes data quality so much interesting and so much complex, right? And it fits beautifully in the data mesh stuff also, because just like data, what data means differs based on decentralized model, that based on the team that's consuming. Data quality also can mean different for different teams in your decentralized model. Simple metric like completeness, out of the box, Telmai will just look for null and not specified type of metric. But we've had we've had folks who said that in our world, NA should be treated as null, and it should be a completeness metric, and that should be different for our financial ops team versus marketing ops. So that's when we take some feedback, human in the loop approach, where our initial models give certain level of metric calculation, but we also have a very intuitive interface where we take users' feedback, and the users can very quickly and intuitively say that NA translates into completeness score, and for this specific team, the threshold calculation for completeness is X, whereas this team, the threshold calculation is X plus 10%, right? So we have that type of a model where we work very beautifully in the distributed system.
Who's in control? Like, say I want to put NA as this is an incomplete field. Is that something that you do in your cloud platform, or is that something that like a local administrator would do?
So that is something that we give what we call as, we have an investigator interface. So with our initial findings, we present it in a format that data product owners can look at it. Data analysts, data QA PMs can look at it. Even data engineers can look at it, and they can give a feedback to Telmai without writing any code. So we are a low code, no code platform. So they can give feedback, and they can provide that in my world, accuracy is XYZ, and they can give some inputs through our tool.
Okay, that makes sense. You mentioned a lot of like data roles there, right? Data investigator, data engineers, very common today. Are you really seeing this kind of, I guess, explosion of more data-centric roles in companies today, or is that kind of case by case?
I'm starting to see a lot more. I mean, I cannot tell you how excited I feel when I see a data quality product manager, data product managers, where there's such a good focus on treating data as a product, treating data quality as a product initiative, where you're prioritizing KPIs for data quality and all. So I'm starting to see a lot more of that. I still feel when we started off Telmai, we were thinking a lot about who's our persona. Is it data engineers? Is it data architect, data product owners? It really came down to, Nick, is job, what I believe in, jobs to be done. right? When you talk about data reliability, depending on the size of the company, the maturity of the org and data quality initiatives, this can go anywhere between data engineers to data governance and data quality leads to, data analyst. So it kind of depends on the org, but the good news is a lot of orgs are now moving towards this decentralized model and even treating data product owners and data quality owners as a very systematic job roles in their data ecosystem.
What kind of sources do you support? You mentioned a lot of data warehouses, databases, and the data observability conversation seems to split between kind of data at rest and data in motion over a pipeline, right? And I've talked to other companies that are doing this over, what they would call like components of the modern data stack in the cloud. And so it's, there might be like a Fivetran in there or a DBT in there and a Snowflake or a Looker and things like that. So they kind of pick and choose where they integrate. How does the Telmai solution work here?
So we definitely position ourselves as a full pipeline monitoring, and that goes with our foundational thinking of shifting data quality to left, that is closest to source. And if we have to shift it to the left, that means we have to support data lakes and different types of sources, different formats. So we support multiple formats, JSON, CSV, Parquet, name it. We support multiple data sources. So from like your data lakes, S3, GCS, BigQuery, Azure Blob, we just announced our Firebolt integration, Snowflake, all of those. Telmai is also architected to support direct monitoring of your data from REST APIs and queues. And this all comes down to how we have architected, because we read data and all the processing happens on our side. A lot of metrics monitoring system go to data warehouse and they run queries on top of your data warehouse to calculate similar metrics of completeness, correctness. So they're more better designed for data warehouse use cases. We are designed for entire pipeline monitoring. And that kind of is the predominant differentiation around our use cases and our target opportunities.
Got it. It's interesting that you're describing a data lake or a data warehouse as a source when, and I think in traditional analytics environments, those would be the destination, right? Like that's the end location for a lot of this stuff is that lake, is that warehouse. I know there's a trend for reverse ETLing today. I'm not sure where I stand on that. Sometimes I'm like, I don't really get it. Other times I'm like, okay, that's a compelling use case. But it is a different view of kind of the data world today. Is that view shared with your prospects and customers today?
So let me clarify. When I mentioned source, I mentioned a source for Telmai, right? There's a monitoring source. I have not bought into this 100% destination source thing. The way I think is most often data pipelines are graph than a linear progression, that it goes from, and that's why you need a metric monitoring system, which monitors almost everything in your pipeline. Going back to your philosophy of ETL versus ELT, I really feel that all of this really boils down to your use cases. I have seen a lot of use cases at Telmai, before Telmai, where folks wanted to, okay, I figured out issues in the data. It has to go back to the source. I want to correct the source. At Telmai, we definitely support remediation is not something a typical observability tool does, but we definitely want our users to find where the source of these issues are, put some monitoring around that so they don't happen again, and also give enough instrumentation so they can go back and fix it even at the source, because that's when you are solving it at the root.
That makes a lot of sense. On the source differentiation, I get that now. That makes sense as a source for Telmai's data. Given the number of sources that exist out there, how long on average, right? Because I know that every company is different. What's the rough adoption life cycle look like for Telmai as a product? I mean, is it a longer rollout, maybe, a year? Is it 6 months? Is it 3 months? So for your average prospect today, how long does that take to start to get value from the Telmai system?
I'll give you a super honest feedback. In this case, the time to adopt Telmai, we have shrunk it dramatically because I've come from large enterprise world like Oracle EMC, where like procurement to actual adoption to really seeing the value used to take months. We definitely designed Telmai in a way through self-service that today you can go after this call, do a trial, put any CSV in Telmai, just upload it, and within 10 minutes you'll start see what the amount of garbage in that CSV, and you can start setting up for monitoring right away. I can guarantee you can get set up in the real issue with typical any data product is the procurement, the sec reviews, the internal binds. And so as much as we all want bottoms up and like easy adoption, even smaller companies have really evolved very rapidly when it comes to policies around new tools and adoption in terms of secure, all for in the good spirit. But that's where it takes time to see the value, not really from the product perspective. The objections are more on the procurement side of it.
Yeah, it's on the process side. We see that as well. That's always a challenge to get through procurement. And as long as the product, I think as long as it is predictable when it comes to pricing, like that helps quite a bit. And being able to kind of have a small landing footprint and hope to grow that over time certainly helps kind of speed things through procurement. Is Telmai available cloud only, or is there also an on-prem story as well?
We have a full SaaS offering where we have fully secured, kind of securely architected. So basically we have encryption at rest, transit, and all the right things in place. And that's for our SaaS model. We also have a private cloud model, very similar to Databricks, that as long as you're comfortable with Spark architecture, we can deploy in your ecosystem. So your data will never leave your premise, and all the processing and the metric calculations will happen at Telmai. So data will stay at your private cloud at your premise, and the metrics will leave and come to Telmai, and we'll share the monitoring too.
Got it. Shifting the conversation a little bit, you and I were talking, as we on our prep call, data observability and observability in general seems to be having quite a moment right now, right? Tons of companies out there getting funded. There's headlines, seems like every week. Tremendous amount of confusion about the whole space, right? Whether it's data observability, network observability, AI observability, and so on. Why do you think there's this sudden interest in data observability, right? I mean, in some contexts, it sounds a lot like data quality. In other contexts, it's more of like end-to-end pipeline monitoring and management, and kind of pervasive fingers everywhere wanting to get statistics. And so there's a lot of different views on what it is to have data observability. But data quality has always been a challenge. Kind of this end-to-end monitoring has always been a challenge. Why now? Why is this like the current problem to be solved?
So let me break this question into a couple questions. The first thing is the concept of observability, right? It comes from control theory, and we both know, given that we are in observability space,
right?
But you can look at many number of external symptoms of a system, a person, or any object, and you can actually predict if there is going to be a failure or an issue in the system. Now, as a concept, it's fantastic because it works for your API observability, it works for infrastructure observability, it works in every single space. And we've seen super success in the infrastructure world and so on. Now, when it comes to data observability, right, like observability really depends on what are you observing. Within data observability space, I've seen two types of vendors typically. Some who specialize in really observing the data infrastructure, which is still for similar persona, which is data architects, data engineers. They definitely care if my Snowflake or my data infrastructure is optimized properly. Am I using it at right capacity? Are they performing properly? Are my queries performing properly? So using the same philosophy of observability to make sure we protect our infrastructure, which by the way, all the companies are paying millions into these infrastructure solutions. So there's one angle of confusion there, that are you really observing the infrastructure and optimizing your observability for data observability for infrastructure? And there is the other angle, which like, are we observing the data itself? Who's your hero, the data itself or the data infrastructure? So there are companies like Telmai who are really observing the data itself. Our metrics are on that data. Is this data really reliable? Right. So the analogy I have is like if I was wearing my Apple Watch or any device that tracks my health versus my home tracking system, right? So really, what source are you tracking? Now, having said that, so there's that confusion, because many of these companies are doing a part of that or both of that or a little bit of each, right? So there's that confusion that's happening around data observability. Now, your question around data quality and why now? Data quality existed from the time that data existed, right? It's not new at all. But data, like the previous generation, data was so controlled, like the volume of the data, the velocity, the variety. So the last generation tools were very heavily focused on data quality policies and governance. The immediate reaction for people were like, let me write a bunch of rules and fix these problems, right? Like, let me write some policies on completeness, correctness, on all of that. Now that off the bat doesn't work in today's ecosystem, because we have big data architectures. Data is mostly semi-structured. So the policies that could be applied on those data structures do not work. So rules don't scale for this type of an architecture and this type of a data ecosystem. So those products are heavily failing and are not able to meet the requirement of this today's ecosystem. And even if you design something, secondly, it's extremely complex to do it with a rules-based approach. So today's data observability tools are betting heavily on statistical analysis and machine learning to calculate these type of metrics, where your data quality, rules, policies are calculated automatically and they evolve with your data. So simple thresholds like row count, right? Your row count cannot stay consistent because your business is changing month over month. So how can you have a policy which checks for row count? You have to have thresholds which are machine learning driven, which take into account seasonality and how your data is changing, and automatically figure out and alert you when there is an issue with the system. Another example is distribution changes in your data, right? How do you calculate that there is a drift in distribution change and then report on that? So all of this is very hard to address by tools, traditional data quality tools, which were the previous generation tools.
That's a great point. I mean, we see the same thing in our observability sector, right? Observability data, so logs, events, metrics, traces. There's just too much variability, right? And the volumes are intense. So trying to kind of set up these rules-based systems that you set and forget, right? And you nailed it, right? Your business is always changing, right? If your business isn't changing, if your data is not changing, you're likely going out of business. So then it doesn't matter anyway. So you really have to stay on top of, how do you enhance all of this observability and quality types of rules out there today? No, it's well put. Are you seeing people get it, right? When you go in and say, we do data observability, like how much time do you spend explaining what that is? Let me take a step back before you answer, actually. How much time do you spend explaining what that is? Or do people have like a preconceived notion of like, oh yeah, that's what I expect it to be?
I think there's a lot of awareness that has to be done in this category. And I'm sure you're facing the same in your world, right? Every time there's a new category, I mean, just what I explained to you, data observability versus data infrastructure observability versus data quality tools. A lot of our time today is definitely to kind of educate our audience about the needs and how these needs cannot be met with today's tools. And there is no clearly defined budget for data observability because it's a new category, right? So it's really like going out there explaining. And I think some of the tools in our ecosystem are doing a great job in doing that education part. But yeah, in all honesty, Nick, there's a lot to be done in terms of educating. I can tell you, I have yet to meet somebody who in the data space who have told me, Mona, data quality is not an issue for me, or I trust the data in my ecosystem. And I have never heard. I'm waiting for the day that I can hear. So people know that reliability issue is a really big issue. They're just now warming up to this idea that you cannot throw a bunch of rules and you cannot use your homegrown system. It just doesn't scale. You have to look at it more systematically and leverage like a more well-designed data observability system for these type of use cases.
It is interesting, and you know, education is key right now, right? I think there's a constant need for evergreen content of like observability 101. And then different, you know, subgenres of observability, depending on what, you know, specific problem you're trying to solve. You know, we deal with that a lot, just like you do. And, you know, if you do a Google Trends search, even today, we've been talking about observability for 2+ years now. But even today, it's what is observability is the #1 thing trending on Google Trends. A lot of other people will say, well, isn't that just monitoring? It's like, well, no, because monitoring is kind of like the things that you know you want to monitor. But to your point about data earlier and where we sit in infrastructure and cybersecurity, things are just changing too quickly. So like by the time you realize there was even a problem, that Kubernetes cluster may be gone, right? And the data that came with it. So you have to collect all of that stuff proactively to be able to interrogate it later on. And there's a lot of other issues around data privacy and things like that. So yeah, just continuing awareness is a constant battle. And you know, you commented earlier about, you know, the article in TechCrunch, and you know, we see similar confusion in VentureBeat, and you know, I think the journalists are just trying to keep up. Right? It's a rapidly changing space. People are raising a lot of money, so I think they're trying to unpack it as well. So that's on us, right? I work in marketing, so it's definitely on me and certainly on you as well. But I think it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next year or so in the data observability space and the broader observability data space.
I mean, I couldn't agree with you on the confusion part, and it's on all of us who are in that ecosystem to kind of clarify these things. Like, I don't know if I already mentioned the data observability versus observability data. I have this ongoing joke with one of my friends who works in observability data space, which I believe Cribl also would be in similar space, where you capture the data that's used for observability, right? Two words used differently, and like TechCrunch is confused. Well, they are saying things, right? So yes, we have a lot to do, but I cannot, I mean, I'm super excited about the potential of using this modern technology and approach to solve a long pressing need around data quality and data reliability. I do strongly believe that there's a humongous potential for every company to adopt data observability and get to their goals of data reliability. So,
oh, excellent, excellent. If folks want to know more about Telmai, where can they find you online?
They can directly go to Telmai, www.telm.ai, get a free trial, but I'm always available directly on my email, mona.rakibe@telm.ai. Shoot me an email. Always would love to talk more about data observability, data ops. These are my topics of interest. So definitely would love to connect.
So are you guys hiring right now?
We are hiring a head of marketing. So just in context of what you said, we got a product, we got an awesome product. It's also a very good problem statement. We got to get the word out in the right way to the right audience, and how remove some of this confusion about data observability. So if you know anybody, if you can help us spread the word, definitely would love that.
All right. So if you're a marketer looking to get into the data observability space, reach out to Mona. She gave her her email address in the recording, and I'll ask Scott to put that in the description as well on YouTube. Mona, thank you very much. This has been great.
Thank you so much, Nick. We'll stay in touch. Bye.
Bye.